If you try to learn a language, you should try to be as productive as possible. You can waste thousands of hours of your time if you try to learn the language the wrong way. In fact, you probably are wasting thousands of hours of your time already. What is your goal in language learning? This is a question that you should ask yourself the very first day when you start learning the language. What are you learning the language for? Because the answer to that is extremely important when it comes to deciding what you're going to do to learn the language. Someone who wants to learn Japanese to be able to understand anime, and just for that, will need a very different learning plan from someone who wants to learn Spanish, to move to Latin America, to meet his future wife there, or whatever. And I'm not only talking about them being completely different languages, I'm talking about the goal being completely different. Maybe the second guy doesn't care about understanding Spanish cartoons, which they exist, by the way, but you probably don't want to watch them. So what you should do really depends on your goals. You should start with the end in mind. So what's the goal? Write down your goals. What do you want to be able to do? And try to be specific. If you say, I want to be fluent in the language, it's all right, but it's quite vague. If you say, I want to be fluent in the language, I want to understand native speakers, and I want to be able to speak about anything when I go to Croatia on holiday next year, you should write that. Be specific. When and with whom, about what do you want to speak, or what do you want to be able to understand exactly. Yeah, I know people who want to be able to understand the news in Russian because they want to follow Russian state media, for example. Yes, I know people like that. Or people who want to be able to understand, I don't know, chess in Russian as well. I know those people as well. People who want to have conversations in clubs, which tend to be different from conversations in an academic environment. Completely different. So write down all the situations, all the conversations you want to have, or write down all the stuff, all the content you want to be able to understand, be it books or shows or whatever. And once you have your goal, and by the way, it could be something like I want to sound like a native speaker. Very ambitious goal, but you could also have a goal, and then you need a game plan for that goal. You would need a very different game plan, a much more extensive learning plan, obviously. But once you've got your goal, you need a plan. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of good plans depending on what your goals are. I know most people's goals tend to be something like the stuff I already mentioned. Either they want to be able to be conversational or relatively fluent, or even fully fluent in the language because they travel a lot and or they want to move to that country, or they want to be able to understand content, interesting content. You get those as well. They don't really care much about speaking the language because they are introverts and they just don't care about meeting people. They just want to understand shows, or they want to understand books. They want to read classics. Yes, there are people like that as well. So those are the main types of goals. I'm going to explain to you how to approach those two very different types of goals. If your goal is to speak and to get conversational as fast as possible and then fluent as fast as possible, you should be focusing on three main things: language islands, shadowing, and retrieval practice. Let's say you want to learn Spanish or Portuguese or French as fast as possible. This is what you should be doing. First, you should write your language islands. Everything you want to be able to say. This should be a very long list. Every possible topic you can think of, every story you normally tell or you'd like to be able to tell, every interaction you have, every situation you find yourself in. Write absolutely everything down. And there should be thousands of sentences there. Those are your language islands. Each one of those topics or interactions, conversation topics, stories is one language island. Right? You should have hundreds of islands and thousands of sentences. Once you've got all of that, not once you've got all of that, you can start creating some and then doing all of this and then creating more every day. So you keep adding to the list. But once you've got your islands, you translate them into the target language, text, and audio. Yeah, you translate them, then you use text-to-speech, and you have audio files, and you have flashcards, and a spreadsheet for both. Flashcards are easy. You just download the spreadsheet and import it to Anki. And you start with shadowing and retrieval practice. How does this work? Well, shadowing is basically listening to the audio files and speaking alongside with it. You repeat the sentences when you're listening to them. And you can have your spreadsheet in front of you, so you have the meaning in English, so you know what you are saying, you know the meaning of every sentence you're saying, and you speak along with it, and you do lots and lots and lots of reps of shadowing every day, thousands of reps. This alone will be enough to get you fluent fast. If you take 2,000 sentences and you repeat the whole list 20 times, that's 40,000 reps. You can do it in 40 days. With those 2,000 sentences, you'll be able to have long conversations and basically any kind of interaction you usually have. You could even give a sales presentation if you prepare it like that. And then you take those sentences, you turn them into flashcards, and you do retrieval practice. So you translate them from English into the target language and then getting instant feedback. This will allow you to recall the information when you need it, because obviously remembering something when you need to use this harder than to repeating it while you're listening to it. But doing it with flashcards like this, translating from English into the target language, and then getting the feedback will allow you to first learn to think in the language, so you can form the phrases and form the sentences and you can say them, and then you get the feedback. So you find your mistakes and you correct them. Test yourself, get feedback, correction, try again, test again. Yeah, but you test by saying it, by remembering the information. You do these three things, write down absolutely everything you need to say, or you want to say, create audio files, shadow it over and over and over again, and retrieval practice over and over again, and you'll soon be able to say thousands and thousands and thousands of sentences. You'll know lots of vocab, all the grammar, with good pronunciation as well. You'll say it with good pronunciation because you've drilled it so much that you've learned the pronunciation. And basically error-free because you've been doing so much retrieval practice. This is how you should learn if your goal is to get conversational and then fluent as fast as possible. And you might be thinking, what about comprehension? Yeah, I can say things, but then if I don't understand the other person, well, that's not really a problem, because if you've learned thousands of sentences with good pronunciation, you'll probably do pretty well with comprehension. And if you worry about that, you just have to need some extra listening to podcasts or radio, something like that on the side, and with that, you'll be fine, right? So this is how you learn to speak a language fast, if your goal is to speak it. But what if your goal is to understand content? What if you're a nerd and you want to watch anime and you want to understand everything, you want to watch, I don't really know much, Dragon Ball Z, for example. That's the only one I know. No, I know Doraemon as well. Yeah, that's my childhood. I think those were the only ones we had. We had Pokemon later as well, I think. Yeah, that came later. Anyway, you want to watch all that stuff, you don't care about talking to people, you just want to be able to understand it in original version. Or you want to read Dostoevsky in Russian, which I've tried. I don't recommend you to do it, but whatever. To each their own. Let's say your goal is to understand content. Well, first, what's the content? Because those two examples are very different, right? Vocabulary, reading the classic is going to be much more extensive and esoteric and complex, much more difficult. TV shows will have much more modern slang. You also need to work on your listening comprehension, different skills. So you need to work on the things that you will need for that specific piece of content. In any case, you'll need a lot of vocabulary. For example, if your goal is to be able to understand films and series, you need lots of vocab. But you need specifically the type of vocab they use there. So if you learn around the 10,000 most common words, you'll understand pretty much everything. That's a very good start. You can do that with mnemonics fast. But those TV series and films and Netflix shows and all those things will have their own specific niche vocabulary as well that is often not part of the 10,000 most common words. So you need to learn that as well. So what I recommend you do is download the transcripts, go through the transcript, identify all the words you don't know, and use mnemonics on those as well. You should always do this before watching the episode. Always memorize the vocab before getting exposed to the content, so that then you review the content in context. The input will be already much more comprehensible and enjoyable, and it's going to be much more effective doing it this way. So always read the transcript first, memorize the vocab with associations first, then review the vocab by actually watching and enjoying the content. And that's it. You should just keep doing this over and over again until you understand everything. What if you want to understand complex text? Well, it's basically the same thing, except instead of watching, you are reading. So after learning the most common words in the language, what you should do is take the text that you want to read, put it through a vocabulary calculator, so you get all the vocabulary listed from the most common words, which you should all know if you've learned the most common words in the language, to the least frequent words. So it'll be a really long list from the most common words to the least frequent words. And the list of less frequent words will be really long in a complex text. If it's an academic text, or especially if it's a novel, there'll be lots and lots of vocabulary there that only shows up once or twice. All those words, you should memorize them with mnemonics before reading the text, so that when you're reading the text, you have seen those words before, you remember them, and you review them in context. So now you remember them much better, but also you understand the text much better the first time you're reading it. So you're much more likely to remember it, and also it's much more enjoyable in general. And this is all you need to do. If your goal is to understand content, this is basically what you need to do. Just memorize the most common words and then memorize the content-specific words. Put the content through vocabulary frequency lists and memorize the whole thing with mnemonic associations. And then you enjoy the content. And then you do it with the next piece of content, and then with the next one, and so on and so forth, until you understand everything. And that's it. So you can see that you should start with the end in mind, because what you do for practice should depend on what your goals are. If your goal is to understand the language well, you want to understand complex content, you should focus on vocabulary. If your goal is conversation and spoken fluency, you should focus on language islands, shadowing, and retrieval practice. Different goals, different approaches, all right? There's no one-size-fits-all approach. Yes, if you want to reach a C2 level and be basically native-like in your comprehension and your speaking, then you should do all those things. You should read the really complex stuff, memorizing all the vocabulary before you read it. You should watch and listen to really complex stuff, memorizing the vocabulary before you consume the content. And you should create thousands of sentences of language islands and do tens of thousands of reps of shadowing and retrieval practice. But if your goal is limited, you should focus on the things that will get you to that goal as fast as possible, right?